I'm Mark Rozelle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University, and we are very proud to host the Michael V. Hayden Center. It's really great to see all of you here this evening. We now have, from the latest count, over 300 persons signed up, both for the in-person and virtual participation in this forum. And these people come from 29 states in the District of Columbia, 15 countries, and 5 continents. So a warm welcome to those of you online from Australia, Canada, El Salvador, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Iceland, Israel, Italy, Kenya, Norway, Switzerland, Thailand, and the United Kingdom. Those of you who are here today, though, in person, have the added bonus of a nice reception after this event with our panel members and with several Schar School scholars. The Hayden Center is a jewel of George Mason University. The quality of these programs is among the best you will see anywhere, I believe, in higher education. And we do it with leading policymakers and thinkers who are committed to addressing the most challenging public policy issues of the day, away from the often overheated debates and discussions in our national politics, so that we can develop an informed understanding of key issues. And this kind of analysis is needed now more than ever. When the Schar School was founded in 2016, our benefactor Dwight Schar expressed his hope for programs such as these that are nonpartisan, non-ideological. They are all about good government, good public policy, wherever it comes from, regardless of party or ideology. And so with that in mind, the Hayden Center was founded 7 years ago by former NSA and CIA director and Schar School professor Michael V. Hayden. Unfortunately, he and Janine would be here tonight except for having come down with COVID. So I know that they are watching, so I'm sending our collective wishes here for their quick recoveries. The Hayden Center has been a prominent voice in explaining and demystifying intelligence and national security issues. And if you've missed some of our past programs, we have all of them on the Hayden Center website and on its YouTube channel. So again, thank you for attending. Hope to see you at future events. And I now welcome to the stage the director of the Hayden Center, Larry Pfeiffer. Larry?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I also send my greetings to General and Mrs. Hayden and hope for their speedy recovery. I was with them last week at a conference, and somehow I dodged the COVID bullet, so we're good to go. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction and all the great comments about the Hayden Center. Tonight's event, if you weren't obviously aware, is being live streamed. It's being recorded. And we also have the good people of C-SPAN here. They expressed interest in recording this event, and it will be airing on C-SPAN a variety of times over the next week, I imagine. We'll know more tomorrow morning. Hayden Center, we're on social media. If you want to play with your phone and offer comments about the event as it goes on tonight, and we got some hashtags and handles up there, please feel free to use them. So tonight's discussion about Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, and all the tragic activity that's going on in the Middle East is definitely one fraught with a great deal of emotion for many Americans, and I'm sure for many people in this audience, and we share that emotion. Tonight, our panel is going to address the subject thoughtfully and respectfully. We would ask, in the finest George Mason University and Schar School and Hayden Center tradition, that you approach tonight's events in the same fashion, allowing the discussion to proceed uninterrupted. We are going to have time for questions from you in the audience, both here in person as well as on YouTube. Our moderator, David Priess, will direct those in the audience to the microphones at the appropriate time as we work our way through tonight's agenda. And for those on YouTube watching, you can use the live chat to post your questions. I would also ask you to be thoughtful and respectful on live chat. I know that can be a little bit Wild Westy, so please, those of you on YouTube, please be respectful of others that you're sharing that space with. When you ask a question, please keep them brief and in the form of a question, no long speeches. That you can give the long speeches later, maybe when we're having a drink or something to eat. Let us know who you are. That's always great, but if you want to remain anonymous, we don't have any problem with that either. Following the event, we've got a great reception with food and beverage in the adjacent multipurpose room. I'd ask at the end of the event, you afford our panel members the opportunity to get off stage and get over to the room before you corner them with, I'm sure, your great thoughts and questions. And with that, let me just introduce our panel briefly. David Priess is our moderator, as he has been many, many times in the past. He is a Hayden Center Senior Fellow, former CIA analyst and briefer, and author. He's currently serving as Director of Intelligence at Bedrock Knowledge, Incorporated. Ambassador Dennis Ross, in the middle of the stage here, is a counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's a former senior diplomat who played a leading role in the Middle East peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations, facilitating several landmark peace treaties, agreements, and accords. Nancy Yosef here at the end is an award-winning national security correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. You've probably also seen her on television. She focuses much of her reporting on U.S. military as well as the Arab world. She, before the Wall Street Journal, is a veteran of the Daily Beast, BuzzFeed News, and McClatchy newspapers, among other activities. And sitting next to David is Mark Polymeropoulos. Mark is a veteran of CIA, Senior Operations Officer, highly decorated. He served in the Middle East, South Asia, including some war zone tours. He is maybe familiar to many of you if you watch NBC in the early morning hours, having been prominently featured on some of their morning shows as a national security correspondent. With that, let me turn it over to David and get the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it. As Larry said, this isn't a policy event. So we know there's a lot of emotion, a lot of energy. We have it too about the issues we're going to be talking about. But none of us, unless any of you took a new job this afternoon, none of us are representatives of the US government, nor the Israeli government, nor Hezbollah or Hamas, nor the government of Luxembourg, none of these. So we are just speaking as observers, as analysts, with experience in different realms, but trying to, in our tradition, explain, trying to help enhance understanding of how intelligence, diplomatic, military, and journalist views come to play when there's a crisis like this that is extended for so long as this has been. So we're not here to politicize, we're not here to polemicize, we're not here to proselytize. I've run out of P words now. We're here to try to shed some light on how these things work in and around the government and to give a sense of the environment, not to defend any particular policy. So with that disclaimer, let's jump in. Mark, I'll start with you because, and I did this for a reason. Typically, the way that government decision-making is supposed to work is that intelligence informs diplomacy and military action. And also, wearing your journalist hat, Nancy, intelligence also can leak to journalists. So the progression here is in the progress, and I'll start with each of you in turn. Mark, representing the intelligence point of view, I want you to reflect now. It's been over a year. Obviously, you did not know what was going to happen on October 7th last year, but it was knowable. Talk about that from an intelligence perspective. What did Israel in particular get right about October 7th? That won't take long. And what should they have gotten better? And how do you explain that a country that went through 1973 and many other issues where intelligence had been honed over time, how did October 7th happen in such an intelligence vacuum?
So first of all, thank you all for having me here. This is a kind of a unique position as a former operations officer. I was an intelligence practitioner, which means I spent a lot of time in these various countries. I've worked with the Israelis, with the Jordanians, with the Egyptians, with the Palestinian Authority. I've worked closely on operations, involved in analytic exchanges, and certainly spent a lot of time at their headquarters. So let me frame this by the morning of October 7th. And as Larry noted, I do some commentary for MSNBC. So I woke up on that morning of the 7th, early morning, to about 55 text messages from MSNBC saying you have to be on the air in 5 minutes with Andrea Mitchell. And I responded back. I said, why? And they said, a 3,500 person Hamas terrorist army has invaded Israel. And I remember I looked at my wife, and we were actually visiting my son, who was playing in a college baseball game. And I said to her, I said, did we actually drink too much last night? and noting that we were quite shocked. And the first thing that came to mind, of course, is that this is Israel's 9/11, not because of the gravity of the attack and the astounding loss of life, but because of what was clearly an intelligence failure. And having worked in the region and worked with the Israelis, I think I was pretty surprised. If you kind of get into the granularity of the Israeli intelligence community, Gaza is not Mossad's responsibility, and a lot of us in the CIA in particular worked heavily with Mossad. But this was more the purview of Shin Bet and Israeli military intelligence. But Shin Bet has an outstanding reputation, and a reputation for recruiting sources, human agents. This is what I did for a living for CIA. You know, it's that granular intelligence based on a single source who can tell you, who can tell you exactly what's going to happen. So it's almost inconceivable that this occurred. You know, did Shin Bet actually fail on this mission? And it turns out, with a lot of very great reporting from certainly from the media, both in the United States and in Israel, is that there was a lack of human intelligence. Now, there were other signs, and David, you certainly alluded to this. There were the watchers along the border. There's going to be, of course, a commission that's subject to Israeli politics. And unfortunately, I think that hasn't happened yet. But there's going to be a very comprehensive after action. We're going to learn a lot more. But the signs were there. I think there were a lot of mid-level and senior officials who were ignoring reports from kind of lower down the totem pole. But what there was not was that single human source saying this is going to happen right now. And I think that's where Shin Bet certainly failed. And it goes back to, again, my old job. I always call it the power of one. It's a single source who in some ways can change the course of history. And that this did not happen. Now, it's not to say the Israelis shouldn't have known, because there were a lot of signs. They actually, again, from excellent reporting, the Israelis did have the actual, an op plan, but it was dated. They had, again, reports from watchers along the border of Gaza, but they were ignored. There's going to be, I think, a lot of introspection about the misogyny. A lot of these were female IDF officers or Israeli military intelligence officers who were reporting in and were ignored by the superiors. But ultimately, it is a rather catastrophic intelligence failure, and for many of us who have worked in the region, we were surprised. Let me add one piece here, and it's a little controversial perhaps, but this also, I don't think we should absolve the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Palestinian intelligence services, and also the US intelligence community. Because again, what do you do as an intelligence officer? My job would be to make sure Ambassador Ross is not surprised. And collectively, the intelligence services of the region failed in that. And I think that is something to be pointed out as well.
It's a good transition. Dennis, there are surprises, of course, and you lived through several of these, although all different in some way than October 7th. But walk us through what that crisis atmosphere is like as a diplomat, as someone who has the connections in the region, as someone who has been working on policy. When there is a crisis like this, how does your job change on that day? We know you weren't there personally on October 7th, but how does the job change when it is suddenly a crisis atmosphere and the entire US government seems to be focused on handling this emergency?
So I'm happy to respond to that. I just want to add one thing to what Mark said. Mm-hmm. This was a classic example of strategic surprise. Mm-hmm. Typically, strategic surprise is always characterized by a groupthink. Based on a set of assumptions, you create a prism through which you see the world, and every bit of information you receive, you interpret on the basis of those assumptions. Mm-hmm. I had been in Israel the summer before. I had seen most of the senior security and intelligence people, and they were all describing Hamas as deterred. They were all describing Yahya Sinwar as having a prisoner's mentality, meaning they understood who he was. Mm-hmm. Prisoners have a way of trying to increase pressure as a way of getting some response. And they would say, look, what he wants is to expand the area where Gaza fishermen can go. He wants to get more work permits. We know how to deal with him. When he raises tensions along the borders to get the Qataris to provide more money. This was a collective view. And when you have that kind of a groupthink, you really create the potential for this kind of a strategic surprise. So what is, on the morning of October 7th here, what was the government going to be doing? How was it going to respond? Having been in circumstances not quite the equivalent of this, but when shocks took place, I can tell you the first thing you try to do is you try to get a picture, okay, what exactly is happening? That's the very first thing you're going to do. So you bring the intelligence people in to tell you, all right, here's what we see, here's what's going on. Then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to contact the Israelis and find out, all right, where are you in terms of responding? What's the situation in the south? Basically, you're trying to get as much information as you can to focus on, all right, what is it we need to do? In a circumstance like October 7th, the first impulse is going to be to get a sense of where the Israelis are, and there was bound to be an understanding they were in a state of shock. And this was something, for them, they couldn't imagine happening. And when it does happen, and it happens on a religious holiday, Simchat Torah, it's actually 50 years plus a day after the 73 war, which took place on Yom Kippur. So they're in a state of shock, and the first thing you're trying to do is not only ascertain what it is that's going on, but trying to get a sense of, okay, what do you need from us? How can we reassure you? There's one dimension that it would be focused exclusively on the Israelis. There's another one that would be focused on, all right, we have to make sure that no one else is going to do anything. So in that circumstance, I'm sure the administration very quickly focused on, is Hezbollah going to join in? What are the Iranians going to do? We need to send messages to them. We need to line up others who have the ability to deal directly with them. Make it clear, don't even think about becoming involved in this. The more you become involved in this, the more you're going to draw us in. You don't want to do that. So your role in that circumstance, in terms of a policymaker, not just a diplomat, but a policymaker, is to, on the one hand, figure out what's going on, try to reassure the Israelis, try to see what needs to be done, not just to reassure them, but to try to channel their behavior, because when you're in a state of shock, you're not necessarily going to make the best decisions, and so you're trying to influence that as well. You're trying to influence as well others who could be trying to exploit the moment, and you don't want that. You want to keep this as localized as you can, and you want to focus on also trying to ensure that those who are at peace with Israel will also play a certain role. No doubt we would have been talking to the Egyptians immediately because they're right on the Gaza border, and also trying to find out from them. And Mark made an interesting point, and I think a correct point. It's not like the Egyptians don't know what Hamas is doing, and yet they were taken by surprise. So you're focusing on those around you. You're focusing on others internationally who you want to make part of a kind of coalition of support for both containing this, but also trying to reassure the Israelis. These are the kind of immediate questions that are going to be raised and the areas that you'd be working in.
Yeah. Thank you. Nancy, I'm going to ask you to wear two hats in the conversation here. One is your own, as a journalist working in your own case previously in some war zones, high-stress areas. But first, I want you to channel some of your own reporting and those of your colleagues from military officers. And similar to what Mark and Dennis have said, walk us through how U.S. military forces, whether deployed in embassies, deployed with allies in the region, October 7th, how did they react? How does the mentality change from the body of reporting that you've done? And what are they prepared to do when there's a crisis involving a U.S. ally?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to speak to you, all of you. I guess I should sort of set the scene running up to October 7th, which was the U.S. military was looking to move out of the Middle East. The plan was that the U.S. wouldn't keep carriers there for any sustained period of time. After doing so for years, that the only sort of counterinsurgency we would be seeing are sort of efforts to contain the Islamic State having largely been shut down, that the U.S. military effort would be twofold. One, supporting Ukraine and getting it weapons and the munitions that it needed to prevail, and to start to pivot the United States military, particularly its Navy, towards threats from Russia and China. You'll remember at the time that a big part of the discussion was 2027 was the year that Xi Jinping would like to be in a position militarily to potentially challenge Taiwan. And so when something like October 7th happened, like the intelligence community, like the diplomatic community, the military was surprised, because the military is a very large organization. It also has its own intelligence, and its generals are also diplomats. And so in many ways that they play many of the same roles that, that my two colleagues have spoken about. And the US has a defense attaché in Israel, and it has contacts through its leadership with its Israeli counterparts. And so the same shock that you have described, we saw at the Pentagon at that time. And then militarily, they have to now think about moving assets into the region for two things. One, to protect their own resources in the region. You'll remember that the US, despite the sort of drawdown, kept a large ground presence in Iraq, in Syria, and throughout the Gulf, in an area where there were Iranian-backed proxies all over. And so the first thing that you started to see the military do was move Patriots and other air defense systems in place to protect forces there as they were coming under attack, more than 200 in all over the course of this past year, starting on October 17th. So we started to see that those resources are very limited and put a strain on the military, because when you put a Patriot battery in some place like Saudi Arabia, you were taking it from someplace else at the minimum, and potentially putting a strain on those forces that have to supply them and have been deployed almost nonstop. The other thing we started to see was the US military starting to move its naval assets into the region to help defend Israel. And we've seen the use of those naval assets in response to the April and October attack, because the destroyers were key to bringing down ballistic missiles, and the fighter jets were key for drones and cruise missiles. I think the one complication that came up that also sort of compounded the situation is we started to see the Houthis in Yemen shut down commercial traffic through the Red Sea, and commercial shipping fundamentally changed in a matter of weeks. And now you had to bring in that carrier strike group to try to protect ships going through and come under attacks that they just didn't anticipate. And so you have a military that literally overnight went from sort of planning for one kind of threat to having to shift all its resources to one that it didn't expect. And all of those have second and third order effects, because every time you have to pull resources into a place you didn't expect, you're sort of borrowing time in the future towards addressing the threats that you know are coming down the road from countries like China and Russia. And so what we've seen very simply is a US military having to really surge a lot of defenses for itself and for Israel, and doing so with the understanding that it is coming at the expense of other parts of the world. What we haven't seen is a US military that has reconciled how long it can do this, at what cost, and how does it strike this new balance. The original plan was that if the Middle East was ever in trouble, that the US would surge forces for a temporary period and then go back to its original planning. We are now entering the year 2 of this war. And so what is temporary? And what does it mean when that's no longer an option? How do you rebalance the force in such a way that you can both support your ally in the region and not put the US in danger in other parts of the world because of this unexpected demand in the Middle East?
Thank you. Mark, I want to pick up on something Dennis said to run by you on the intelligence side. You just heard that it was almost 50 years to the day after the Yom Kippur War. And in the US context, we know, because we lived through it, after 9/11, so much introspection, so many studies, so many reviews of what could we have done better in collection, what could we have done better in analysis to predict 9/11. The Israelis did that about 73, and they did it really well. The amounts of studies, entire books, dissertations have been written reflecting on the lessons of 1973. And a lot of us had the assumption that, okay, Israel has a step up on strategic surprise because they learned the hard way, and they're actually not going to be surprised like this. What do you make of the fact that the irony of 50 years almost to the day after that, that this could happen even in a military and intelligence culture that trains that kind of failure and how to avoid it to every single person?
So I think the answer to that is twofold. One is, there is an element of hubris that kind of envelops a culture and a community which is actually really good. I mean, the Israeli intelligence community is world class. And I think what happened with them is they became over-reliant on technology, particularly when it came to Gaza. This is the use of sensors, this is use of drones. But they also became trapped, and you're right in the sense, this is surprising, they became trapped in what Israeli policy was. And Israeli policy was to, in a sense, pay off Hamas to be quiet. This is with, of course, the payments through the Qataris. This is something that, again, in retrospect, when you see some of the reporting, David Barnea, the head of Mossad, actually went to Prime Minister Netanyahu and asked, should we still be doing this? And the answer was yes. I get a sense that even the U.S. administration was okay with this as well, because they thought Hamas was in this box. So it became, there's some hubris and over-reliance on technology, and then it, in essence, becomes trapped by a policy that you think is working. And I think for a lot of us in the intelligence business, it's a really good reminder that you have to stay on your toes, you have to challenge assumptions. You certainly have to listen to your people. And the after-action report, the review, which will come, and it will be brutal, I think the hardest part of this is that there was going to be mid to junior level officers within the Israeli intelligence community who did provide that warning. Let me add one other point, though, that I think it's important, because in the days after that, I think a lot of people, both I'm sure current U.S. intelligence officers, but also a lot of us formers, remembered back to 9/11. And the feeling that we had at CIA after 9/11 is that we failed America. It was a terrible feeling. And of course, it gives you then a strength, a resolve to fight back. But that, in the conversations I had with former Israeli intelligence officers, they had that same feeling. This was a catastrophic fail. And one of the things, and perhaps we'll get to it in a bit, is that the Israeli intelligence community has rebounded. They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. And again, I'm not condemning or condoning what has occurred in the year afterwards, but the bottom line in terms of the threat from Hamas to carry out another October 7th-like attack, and currently what Israel is doing in rather remarkable fashion to Hezbollah, in many ways the Israeli intelligence community has rebounded for what was that catastrophic failure. But again, it's the notion of hubris. You've got to be very careful. Don't believe your own hype, and every intelligence officer has to understand that.
I mean, rebounding from it is one thing, and I take your point there, but Dennis, there's also the issue of how do you inform policymakers for secondary and tertiary effects. Intelligence isn't always good at that because it's really, really hard. It's hard to know what someone else is going to do, much less how other actors are going to react to that with other variables playing in over a long period of time. But in the last year, the United States administration has had to make some tough choices, as have many other governments and entities. How do you think that has played out in terms of the factors of how is Iran going to come in, if at all? How is Hezbollah going to react? These are very complicated dynamics that don't have a clear precedent. There's no rule book to go to and say these exact factors have occurred in this way. So from a policymaking perspective, how do you deal with such complexity, with such high stakes in such a short period of time?
All good statecraft starts with having very clear objectives. Yes, you have to make very good assessments of what the reality is and what can happen. In a context where you've just had a shock, the first thing you have to do is you've got to figure out, all right, how do we sort of stabilize to the extent that we can? How do we try to minimize the broader fallout from this? But what is the real objective that we have? And I think the Biden administration, for a lot of understandable reasons, their basic objective was, let's try to contain this as much as we can. Let's try to reassure the Israelis that, we understand, what has happened here. We understand that no one could live with this kind of a group next door to them. So we're going to try to reassure the Israelis on the one hand. We're going to try to contain things on the other. I don't think there was more of an effort to define objectives beyond that. What you're really asking for in a situation like that is, what are your immediate objectives and needs, and what do you want to do 2-3 steps down the road? I mean, you're trying to play chess in a circumstance like that, not checkers. And to be fair, any administration in that circumstance is going to immediately deal with what are the immediate challenges. And someone who comes in and says, gee, I want you to play chess right now. So tell me, let's think through our second, third, and fourth order moves. they're probably not going to be listened to. Just because the pressure of the moment, the sense of urgency is going to be so overwhelming. But I think, within a relatively short period of time, you do have to begin to ask yourself the question, all right, what do we want to come out of this? We really don't want to be in a situation where we just get back to October 6th. We really want to be in a situation where the context, because of the shock, we should also focus on how do we actually change the circumstances? Not only so that we don't simply revert to a status quo ante, which is unlikely in any case, but also, is there something that can be made of this? Is there something that is more hopeful that we can create out of this? And not because you have a tragedy and therefore you want to be Pollyannish, but because when you have any huge event, I come from California, so the natural instinct is to fall back earthquakes, right? The analogy is an earthquake. Well, when you have an earthquake, the one thing you know is the land's going to resettle. From a policymaking standpoint, before the land resettles, what can you do to change the circumstances? Because this has created, as bad as it is, it also creates a potential opportunity. So how can you begin to focus on what could be a potential opportunity? And as I said, look, I already acknowledged it's pretty hard to get anybody to focus on that in the first days. But you really want to try to steer an orientation towards that within a relatively short period of time. Also because you're trying to influence the Israelis. They're in a state of shock. They have no military plans on the shelf to deal with this because they didn't think this could happen. Partly, as Mark said, it partly was hubris, but it was, they believed the equivalent of October 7th is what Hezbollah had in mind for the North. So they had built up a capability for the North. They have a extremely, how can I say it, an extreme right-wing government, a combination of messianic nationalists in a coalition with the religious parties, the most right-wing government you've ever seen in Israel. So there was a very strong settler component to this. They were expanding settlements. Violence had gone up on the West Bank. They were insisting to the IDF, you have to stop the violence. So the IDF presence in the West Bank was much greater. So you have a presence in the North, you have a presence in the West Bank, you have almost no presence in the South. Partly because you're complacent, partly because you don't think Hamas has an interest in war. And so you don't have a plan on the shelf. And you're not thinking in terms of, okay, here's what we have to do in terms of ensuring Hamas can never again be a threat, but you hear the terms, we're going to eradicate Hamas. Well, we couldn't eradicate ISIS. We could defeat them. So, one of the things I think President Biden tried to do right away when he goes over there, and he takes a trip, which is unprecedented for an American president to go to Israel during wartime, and he's basically saying, don't make the mistakes we did after 9/11, which is wise counsel, but it still needs to be tied to, okay, what's the objective? And if the objective is Hamas can never again be a threat, okay, let's talk about what it takes to be able to ensure that Hamas can never again be a threat. It can't be a threat militarily. It still won't be politically in control of Gaza. What does it take to be able to get to that? And I think that's what I would have liked to have seen more discussion of, even though it's very easy for me to sit here and say that in retrospect. When you're dealing, and this is the first question you asked, when you're dealing with the crisis and the shock of the moment, it's not so easy to be focused on what is more of the, all right, what are the consequences here, and how can we focus on not just the immediate tactical needs, but what are the more strategic objectives we'd like to set? I would, that's, I think, what you would like to see in a circumstance like this.
Can I pick up on that? Because you talk about sort of the need for a military plan and how there wasn't one there. A military plan for this kind of war is incredibly complicated for even the best of militaries. You're talking about going into a very dense urban environment where you believe that Hamas fighters are hiding amongst civilians in civilian sites. When the U.S. went after ISIS in Mosul and Raqqa, and I had a chance to tour Raqqa right afterwards, that city was completely destroyed. But people had someplace to go. They could leave. Same thing in Mosul. So now you're talking about a more entrenched Hamas in a more densely populated area with no place to go. So I just wanted, when you say there wasn't a plan on the shelf, that's absolutely right. But the plan that would have been required would be so demanding of any military because of the complexities of that fight.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to minimize.
Oh, I know,
that.
yeah.
And I completely agree with what you're saying. There was, you look at Raqqa and Mosul, people could leave. In Gaza, they couldn't leave. Now we can go through all the reasons. Egypt was afraid if they left, they would never go back. They were afraid that they were going to play into a narrative that this is Israel's objective for dealing with the Palestinians, just to expel them. No one wanted to play into that narrative. The question is, had we early on tried to focus on, we have to find some way out for Palestinians, and if there had been a set of assurances that could have gone with that, maybe that would have, again, made this part of a larger political strategy. What I'm saying is I'm not trying to minimize the difficulty. The difficulty was immense in an atmosphere that made it really hard to think clearly. And it's easy sitting here in retrospect to say, gee, I can see clearly what the kind of things that should have been done. But you started with the first question, what is it that a policymaker and diplomat should be doing? And I would try to always urge them in a situation where you have a shock to take a step back, as hard as it is, to think about, okay, we have a set of tactical immediate needs, but we also have a set of strategic objectives. Let's at least discuss that.
That's a great point.
Nancy, I want to pick up on something you mentioned there as well, because in a lot of these retrospectives that we've seen in the last few weeks, about 1 year since October 7th, there naturally is a lot of coverage of the human dimension. And naturally, I think a lot of coverage of policy choices made by the Israeli government since October 7th, much less on the experience of journalists, the journalists who are on the ground in Gaza on and after October 7th, journalists in Israel, journalists in Lebanon, and what it's like to be in an active war zone, bringing the kinds of reporting that you and your colleagues have provided. Talk through a little bit of the mentality and how your perspective changes as a journalist on the ground in those circumstances.
So I spent several years in Iraq, a year in Afghanistan, and then covered Arab Spring from Egypt and Libya. But I've never covered a conflict like this, where my blood country, my birth country, was coming under this kind of attack. Remember that Western journalists could not get into Gaza. They were forbidden from going, so we were depending on local journalists on the ground. Some of them had very limited communications. Cell service was cut off at times. And you could tell that the community was doing everything they could to let the world see what was happening. What was happening was an incredible attack on civilian infrastructures and civilian sites. 1 year later, 70% of buildings in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. It's an extraordinary amount of impact on everyday civilians in a community where distinguishing between civilian and foe is very, very complicated. And so I think over the past year, I found myself thinking a lot about those journalists because we heard them, we saw them on air sometimes, learning about the death of their families, their friends, their homes, moving from one place to another. And they were essential and remain essential to our understanding of what's happening. And now we're seeing it play out in Lebanon as well. I was waiting for a briefing to start today, and my colleague who's Lebanese just pulled out her phone and said, this is my family's house in Beirut, destroyed a week ago. And she doesn't know if, what that means. She said to me, 30 years of my dad's work gone. And so as a journalist, you're depending on colleagues who are suffering through this in a very, very real way, and we're depending on their perspective. I think the other challenge journalistically is, as a producer of journalism, you always get from readers this feedback that they, too often I feel, want us to sort of validate their points of view. And this has been that times 1,000 when you're trying to sort of give people some perspective. The demand signal on you to sort of validate points of view in a very, very divisive issue has been the other challenge for those of us writing. But more than anything, it's been a year of watching your colleagues suffer in a way that I have no idea and will never know, and trying to give voice to that, and at the same time engage readers in such a way that there's some room for me to give perspective without the expectation of validating a point of view.
I'll encourage you all to start thinking of questions because we'll start taking questions in a few minutes. but I want to get a take from each one of you on this. If we were to have held this event a year ago, just a few days after October 7th, we would have been talking about, how much damage did the attack actually do? When will hostages be returned? How wide will the conflict spread? How deep will it go? How much will a government in Israel that may be prone to react massively, what will be the secondary and tertiary effects from that? It seems to me we're facing a lot of those same questions right now. And we haven't resolved. We have new information on some of those things that have gone forward, but we're still facing some of those same questions now in regards to Lebanon, and perhaps by the time this event is over, Iran. We don't know. So Mark first, but all of you, reflect on that. What do we know now that we didn't know exactly a year ago? And are we really facing the same fundamental questions, showing that a lot of the groundwork you talked about, Dennis, may not have been done as much as we expect?
So I think, looking back now, and again, this is talking about the first, let's say, hours and days after October 7th, I think the way I would portray it was, what is the U.S. counterterrorism community thinking? 46 Americans were killed on October 7th. These are dual nationals, but they have a blue passport. And that means if you work in the U.S. national security establishment, that's all that matters. So 46 Americans were killed in a mass casualty event. I'm not sure we understood that day. Another part of it has to do with not the decapitation or the kind of the strong Israeli response against Hezbollah, but also the open heart surgery that the Israeli forces are putting on them. Hezbollah was thought to be 10 feet tall. This was in essence, deterrence that Iran had to prevent a strike by Israel on Iranian nuclear facilities. The Israelis have absolutely done extraordinary damage. Again, something that I don't think any of us would have thought even capable or possible. So I think thinking things through, it's also, did we misjudge the strength of Hezbollah, or did we not realize how Israel had been so effective, unlike what we were talking about previously, their reaction in Gaza, how after 2006, and a disastrous war, how the Israeli intelligence and military establishments have absolutely focused on Hezbollah. The Israeli intelligence community has penetrated them to the core. You saw operations such as the pagers and the walkie-talkies. You saw the first, second, third, and fourth tiers of Hezbollah now no longer existing. So again, thinking back now, extraordinary that has occurred. But the final piece, and I know I'm kind of jumping around, but something that I think is really critical to try to reflect on now is the role of intelligence in the region. And Ambassador Ross certainly will remember this from his time, that some of the foundations of these bilateral relationships between Israel and the Arab states is in the intelligence side of the house. And so one of the things that I have seen that has actually surprised me in a sense, in a positive way, is that the relationships between, for example, the Israeli and the Jordanian intelligence communities have held. This is between Jordan and the GID, an organization I work with very closely, and then both Mossad and Shin Bet. King Abdullah and the Jordanian foreign minister have been very critical of the Israelis, but quietly behind the scenes, the two intelligence sides are still working because Hamas is seen as a common enemy, as is, of course, Hezbollah, because of the fear of Iran and her proxies. And so thinking back now, and I would ask Nancy, I think it's a great story for the future, the status of these bilateral intelligence relationships that Israel enjoys with select our partners, and the fact that they've held now. And I think talking about opportunities for the future, perhaps that's something that will lead to something positive coming out this in the end, if there would ever be normalization when this kind of awful conflict does come to an end.
So I want to sort of answer this along two very distinct dimensions. One relates to something that I've spent a lot of my life trying to produce, which is Israeli-Palestinian peace. And the other relates to how the region strategically may have changed because of where we are, and not necessarily in a negative way. So let me start with the first. For Israelis, it's still October 7, 2023. Today, it's still October 7, 2023. They still have 101 hostages, probably 50 are still alive, and who knows how much longer they'll be alive. You go travel anywhere around Israel, you see the pictures everywhere. Everybody knows somebody. That's part of the reason it's still October 7th, 2023. Part of the reason is there's never been an explanation for what happened on that. Strategic surprise we can explain, but there's never been an explanation why it took the IDF 8 hours to get down to the south. There's never been an explanation for it. That's because there also hasn't been a state inquiry commission. That's also because there's no accountability. There's been no accountability for the military, no accountability for the political leadership. So the trauma of October 7th is very much, I would say, something that describes the reality of Israel today. They are consumed by that trauma. Palestinians are also consumed by a trauma because the level of death and destruction in Gaza, you were saying, 70% of the buildings are either destroyed or partially damaged. And the death and destruction, you know, it doesn't matter that Hamas had built an underground city and that nobody, you know, no Palestinians in Gaza could go into the tunnels to get protection. It doesn't matter the numbers, at least from a Palestinian standpoint, the numbers of people who have been killed, the death and destruction is so overwhelming that they have a trauma. Now, two publics and societies that are traumatized are consumed by their own sense of pain, and they have no capacity to feel anybody else's pain. So the idea that we can take these two traumatized societies and we're going to suddenly transform this into making peace doesn't fit the psychological or the political reality in either place. It doesn't mean you throw up your hands and you do nothing, because that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it is a reminder that one of the things you have to do is when this is over, and at some point it will end, when it's over, you have to focus on how do you begin even to establish the idea that Israelis and Palestinians can cooperate at a functional level, just to show that cooperation is still a possibility. Yes, you're going to have to create some kind of political vision and some kind of political track with a sense of reality. The idea that you can suddenly move in the direction of produce a Palestinian state or two states. Israelis are convinced that a Palestinian state will be led by Hamas or a group like that. That's not just Netanyahu or this government. That's the public, left to right. So you're going to have an approach that demonstrates if there's going to be a Palestinian state, there'll be a series of benchmarks that would have to meet before it would demonstrate for the Israeli public that this is not going to be a fundamental threat. By the same token, you can't allow an Israeli government, if you're requiring something of the Palestinians, to go ahead on the ground and make it impossible to ever have a Palestinian state. So you're going to have to create some parallelism here in terms of rights and responsibilities. But against that, I would also say, as hard as that's going to be, Israel now has dramatically weakened the threat it faced from Hamas, dramatically weakened the threat it faced from Hezbollah. The two fronts that it faced in Gaza and the Lebanon border, the realities are fundamentally different. The most important proxy that Iran had, by far, was Hezbollah, for a whole variety of reasons. The only place where they successfully exported the Islamic Revolution. They trained all the other Shia, in this case also a Sunni militia. They trained them. They built their local arms industries. Hezbollah was their critical player throughout the region, and the 150,000 rockets were designed to deter the Israelis from going after the nuclear infrastructure in Iran. And that's basically been fundamentally weakened. So that suggests that the axis of resistance is not what it was. Now, maybe that also creates a context for thinking about how you try to change the region for the better. Now, I do think you can't do it if you can't end the war. And I'll conclude with this. I think the administration has had a very logical, even a morally appropriate strategy of trying to end the war by doing a hostage deal. The whole approach was you get a hostage deal, that will create a pause. The pause will allow you to structurally deal with the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The pause will also allow you to finalize the Saudi-Israeli normalization deal, which will have to have a Palestinian dimension, which will allow you to begin to create a political process there. All that was sort of logical and even morally right because we had American hostages, not just 46 who were killed, but we still had American hostages who were among those being held. The problem was, even if you assume that Prime Minister Netanyahu was serious about wanting to do a hostage deal, that whole approach made Yahya Sinwar an arbiter of whether or not you could succeed. And maybe it was worth testing that. In fact, I would say beyond that, it was definitely worth testing that. But I think you always needed to have an alternative. And the alternative, in my mind, was how about an approach that focuses, instead of a hostage deal to end the war, how about ending the war to get the hostages released? Now here, it may sound far-fetched, but the Israelis, when it comes to Gaza, they have dismantled Hamas as a military. They have destroyed most of the Hamas military infrastructure, meaning weapons depots, weapon labs, weapon production facilities, and at least half of the tunnels. So from the standpoint of making sure that Hamas can't be a threat, if it's clear there can be an approach that ensures they can't be reconstituted because there won't be smuggling, Gaza was an open-air prison for the Palestinians who lived there, but it was not an open-air prison for Hamas. They got whatever they needed. I mean, you don't produce 350 miles of tunnels if you're not getting everything you needed. You don't produce the full array of weaponry that they were producing unless you were getting everything you needed. So if you can also assure the Israelis that you're going to stop the smuggling, and you then deal with the day after, we already know the UAE is prepared to contribute to a stabilization force. You focus on creating some kind of interim approach for Gaza, which has to have a Palestinian dimension to it. Then you're actually in a position with Netanyahu to say, okay, look, you need to be able to declare success. And it looks like you're not that far from it. In Lebanon, is there not a moment now, given the complete disarray that Hezbollah is in? And I saw, just before I came here, I saw a video of one of the Hezbollah fighters who was captured, explaining that they're completely cut off from everybody, not a surprise given the loss of command control communications. And the local commanders, the previous senior commander and deputy commander had both been killed already. The guys who were replacing them, they described, because we couldn't contact them, they just ran off. So there, Hezbollah is in a state of total disarray. There is a possibility to have the Lebanese government reassert its sovereignty. You could change the reality there as well. You know, I'm not trying to suggest that, gee, everything is going to be great. I'm suggesting, out of the current circumstances, you actually have some potential to transform what the reality looks like in the Middle East, and it's worth making that effort.
And Nancy, your reflections 1 year later.
Well, over the past year, there have been two areas that I've been focused on journalistically. One is U.S. weapons sales to Israel. At the start of the war, the Biden administration made it clear that it was not going to alter that, and in fact sped up weapons sales to Israel in support of it, allowing it to sort of plan not only its operations in Gaza, but also in Lebanon. We saw one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs suspended in a sort of protest to the Israeli approach to Rafah. I think it's fresh on my mind because there was a letter today from the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State really opening the door for the first time in a very formal way that the U.S. may revisit this. So I'm curious how the war changes, how that the U.S. and Israel weapons sales happen. I think during the Biden administration, one thing we've seen not only in Israel but across the world is the use of weapons sales as a tool of foreign policy. And so I'm interested in how that might potentially change in the weeks ahead. And then because of the beat I cover, I'm always interested in how this changes the U.S. military. The U.S. has learned a lot from Ukraine. It's been watching what's been happening in Israel and Lebanon very closely. I think it also came into this with certain sort of assumptions and calculations about how the Middle East would be, and those have all been upended. And so how does this change how the U.S. military thinks about threats? How does it strike that balance? Can it really be in all places? Or does it have to prioritize? And do we start to see a shift in the U.S. approach, not out of a change in Israeli-U.S. relations, but just out of a need because of resource limitations that requires a different U.S. footprint in the region? So it's a very journalist answer because I'm always looking for stories, and those are stories that I could do in my head, but those are some of the areas that I'm thinking about as we enter year two of this conflict.
Thank you. We now welcome your questions. As you reach to the mic on the right, your left, or the left, your right, please introduce yourself if you would like. Please do ask a question. And also, if it's directed for a particular panelist, please say that. Otherwise, we'll just all look at each other and decide who will answer by psychic communication. Please, let's start on this side.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, Maurizio from Italy. I'm a postdoc researcher here. I'm also a lieutenant of Italian Navy. My question is for Mr. Ross and the other panelists. You spoke about the strategic future, what does it take to win? You spoke also about the weakening of these terrorist groups. These terrorist groups are weakened, but in the long term, they have the support from outside allies. So my question is, what does it take for the US and Europe also to push Iran economically, diplomatically, and also our allies? Because Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, which is a NATO ally, they have Hamas, cells. So why don't we use more a wolf warrior diplomacy like China and Russia does with our allies to push them to stop the support to these terrorist groups and make finally the DDR, the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of these groups, transform them in political parties like we did with the FARC in Colombia or other countries around the world, and finally have a stop of this madness. Thank you.
First, I would say I haven't seen a whole lot of success from the Russians and the Chinese being able to change the behavior of their allies or non-allies. Look, I think what is required, this is a classic example that we need to be kind of building a coalition. Now it starts with, okay, what is it we're trying to achieve, and how do we create some kind of division of labor among a coalition? One example I was sort of getting at is, can we build in Gaza when the war is over? And you have to have a combination of reconstruction, but you have to be able to provide administration and security. You have to be able to manage that. You're going to have to be able at some point to try to ensure that the Palestinian Authority, which is not reforming, is reformed to the point where it could play a role in Gaza, so you in time could reunify the West Bank and Gaza. Who can come in and play this role? We know the UAE is prepared to play a role. It's inconceivable that in Gaza, Egypt is not prepared to play a role. They're certainly not going to let anybody else go in there if they're not also playing a role. But what about, are there some Europeans who can play a role? What would we expect of ourselves? What would others require of us for them to be prepared to play more of a role there as well? If you're moving along those lines, and at the same time, because you've ended the war, the Saudis, by the way, still want the defense treaty with us. They know they don't get the defense treaty without a normalization deal with Israel. They require a Palestinian dimension for that, something that might be called a credible pathway to a state. It has to be done in a way, I was saying, that the Israelis don't view it as a fundamental threat, but the Israelis also have to assume a set of responsibilities themselves. This is kind of a moment to try to put together a broader coalition, especially because you've got plenty of our allies don't want to see anything like this happen again. Can we persuade everybody that there is a moment here, there's almost a vacuum, vacuums get filled, better for us to fill it than to have the kind of forces that usually fill vacuums go ahead and act to do that.
Thank you. Let's seek some balance and go to this side.
All right. I'm Ken Marcord. Given that the main objective of the Hamas attack was to take hostages, given that the Hamas fighters were only lightly armed, given that the Israelis bombed their own military base, given that helicopter gunships made 28 runs over the music festival, given that the Israelis fired tank rounds into buildings housing hostages, is it possible that the Israeli military killed more Israelis on October 7th than Hamas did? And in this regard, someone might explain the Hannibal Directive.
It's a jump ball. Who wants it?
I think that, I think some of those statements that you made there are probably in a bit of dispute in terms of what happened on October 7th and some of the actions that were taken by the Israeli forces that responded. A commission will certainly uncover this. I think, as has been noted here, there's a lot of questions on what happened that day, and but I think we have to be very careful in talking about friendly fire incidents and things that happen in the fog of war. And I I would challenge the notion that the Israelis killed more of their own people than the Hamas members did. I think that probably is inaccurate.
Thank you.
We'll all wait for the commission.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully an independent commission.
I'm Mark Katz, a professor emeritus here at George Mason University Schar School. Thank you all for this presentation. My question is for Mark. You talked about intelligence failure on the part of Israel, US, Egypt, Jordan, et cetera, et cetera. I can't help but wonder, though, was there not intelligence failure on the part of the other side? In other words, did Hamas really anticipate the furious reaction that Israel launched against them? And it seems that there have been reporting that that Hamas actually anticipated that once they made their attack, that Hezbollah and Iran would, of course, jump in and help them. And of course, this did not turn out to be the case. I'm also wondering, you know, was there an Iranian intelligence failure? Did they really know that Hamas was going to do this and screw up so badly and cause problems for them? You know, we use the word proxy, which kind of indicates that, you know, one country kind of controls or influences someone. But I'm not quite sure these are really Hamas or Hezbollah are so much proxies as very difficult allies. Anyway, I'm just sort of wondering, you know, if you could talk a little bit about the intelligence failure on the part of the other side.
So I think you raised some outstanding questions, and let's go kind of piece by piece. First of all, on the Hamas side, I think there's a lot of unknowns still. You know, there was, you know, I think the conventional wisdom at the beginning was that, you know, Hamas certainly conducted the attack, and this was laid out in multiple press accounts, but in order to cause problems with the whole idea of normalization. And that may be the case, but I think we have to be careful. And what you see now, and the Israelis have been releasing this over the last couple days, are documents that they have uncovered from the tunnels of Gaza, which give, I think, a little bit of a different or a new idea on what certainly Hamas and Sinwar were thinking. The Israelis have a lot of experience with Sinwar. Of course, he was in Israeli jails for a long time. There's been some, you know, psychological profiles done of Sinwar. But I think you get to a very interesting point where there was a much more of an expectation that Hezbollah, Iran, and perhaps even when you think now about going to, and this is more about Hezbollah with Syria, but how other allies in the Middle East would have responded. Let's flip to the key intelligence question, though, that I think you raised, is the degree of Iranian knowledge, the degree of Iranian involvement. And I will credit Nancy's paper, the Wall Street Journal, who very early on wrote a piece from their correspondents in the region that said Iran was in the know. This was disputed by the United States intelligence community. It was disputed, in fact, by the Israeli intelligence community. But what these documents that have just now been uncovered, and take it with a grain of salt, the Israelis are releasing this, and they look to be legitimate, but that the Iranians were certainly involved in this. So one can argue that notion of Iranian surprise actually is not accurate. And one of the things that I thought of when this debate began several months ago is, in the intelligence world, if you're the IRGC, when you work with proxy groups like Hamas or Hezbollah, you do two things. One is you do capacity building. You train them, you equip them, but you also recruit them. So the notion just outright that the Iranians were surprised by October 7th never made sense to me, and I think a lot of others who I speak with. And now it turns out that the Iranians might have been actually much more fully aware of this. And I think that then leads to some really serious questions that U.S. policymakers are going to have to kind of think about, because now, as I said before, 46 Americans were killed on that day. That is direct Iranian involvement, or one could go down that line. And you also have, of course, what the Iranians are doing in terms of assassination plots against former U.S. officials. So you see in Iran, which perhaps is not as benign an actor in this, who were surprised, who were kind of concerned, there's all the notions the Iranians don't want a wider war, and there's a lot behind that. But there's some intelligence now that's kind of being uncovered, and I think our understanding is changing a bit that perhaps Iran was a much more nefarious actor in this. And I think that's a really important subject that the next administration, whoever it may be, is going to have to grapple with.
Can I jump in on that and just say, I think your questions are so interesting because in a way it brings this conversation full circle. If that we don't know 1 year later why Sinwar, Iran, these key actors acted the way they did, I think makes it harder to then answers at least one reason why it's been harder to figure out how you get to a resolution, what the objectives are. It in some ways, I think, starts with the inability to answer the why this happened, what everybody involved was aiming for. I was thinking about, my first war was the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Everybody misunderstood each other, but a year in, we understood what everybody was aiming for, even if their aims were off. It's just, as you were asking your questions, I was fascinated by the fact that we don't know yet. How do we answer some of the questions that we've been talking about without being able to answer that very basic question of why?
But I'd build on what both of you said to go back to the heart of your question. What conclusions are they going to draw now? Because they clearly did miscalculate. No way did they want the result to be that Nasrallah, who was very close to Supreme Leader, would end up dead. No way. So they look at what's happened to a very important actor for them, and I think they have to say, okay, whoever was responsible for shaping these policies, maybe we shouldn't listen to them quite so much. And we actually see a bit of a debate going on right now anyway in the Iranian elite, but that gets to the question of it wasn't only the Israelis who were surprised or miscalculated.
Let's take a question here.
Thanks for interesting discussion. My name is Kamran Mamadli from Georgia. I'm doing my PhD at Carter's Peace School. You mentioned that Hamas and Hezbollah was dismantled. And I just want to maybe hear more from you about the implications which was brought after the 1 year of war and attacks in Gaza. Last summer, I was back home in Georgia with my son, trying to have a nice weekend. And Tbilisi is a diverse city. We have mosque, synagogue, Orthodox church in one street. And we take a route. I wanted to show my son that what a diverse city we are living. We went first to Orthodox church. He enjoyed it. He learned a lot. We are Muslim. We went to mosque. He liked it. And when I told him that we were going to synagogue to see synagogue, he was scared. He said that, no, we are not going. We are Muslims. They are going to kill us. I'm not implying that that's the reality. What I'm trying to say is that there is huge population, Muslim population, which with the influence of social media, with the influence of videos, are seeing what's happening. What yesterday, the Al-Aqsa Mosque attack, which killed 15 kids, alive burning people. That tragedy not only affects Israel and Palestine and people living in Gaza, definitely the worst pain is felt by people living in Gaza, but it has implications on Muslims around the world and humanity, a lot of people around the world. How much is enough? We dismantle, as you said, yeah, the West, the support of Israel, America, dismantled Hamas, Hezbollah. That's amazing. But how we are going to deal with the implications that is faced by a Muslim population around the globe? Thank you.
So, dismantling of Hamas and Hezbollah at what cost?
So there's a really good point there, because you look at this from the counterterrorism perspective in several ways. One is the actual operations run against a certain group. So have Hamas and Hezbollah, and we're not going to say destroyed, because that's that's not really words that you use in the counterterrorism community. But have both groups been rendered to a point where they're not as much of a threat against Israel? Absolutely. And let me just throw in one more point too, from the U.S. counterterrorism perspective. Both are designated terrorist groups. Both have killed Americans. Never forget Hezbollah until Al-Qaeda. Until 9/11 was the entity that killed more Americans than any other group, and a lot of us worked very long and hard against Hezbollah. But you make a very good point in terms of radicalization. And I think the U.S. counterterrorism community, and I just heard the acting director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Brett Holmgren, speak, and he said there is a huge concern on radicalization throughout the world because of what has happened in Gaza. And that's something, again, not condemning or condoning, that's something as a counterterrorism professional, you have to take this very seriously. And how is it manifests in several ways in terms of monitoring the threats, particularly to the United States, both here and abroad. Number one is, will Hamas turn into an insurgency? Will Palestinians in Gaza, young Palestinians, be so outraged that they join en masse again? But the other aspect of the radicalization is what we call the lone wolf attacks. And there's huge concern in the U.S. Community that this is something that we may see for years to come because of what has happened in Gaza. Again, this is not condemning nor condoning Israeli behavior there and the civilian casualties, but it is an after effect, and it's something that is incredibly serious. And it's very hard for U.S. officials to counteract this. I just talking to my former colleagues and friends in the FBI, for example, we have something called the Joint Terrorism Task Force. That's units, that's entities in each major American city made up of different federal agencies, and they are absolutely focused on this because, again, there's a concern, especially with social media, with individuals being able to be recruited online, that a lone wolf will take action based on what they've seen in the region. So again, from my old world, there is an effect on what has happened there, and it's something that I think we're going to struggle with for years to come.
We will have time for all questions in the reception afterwards, but I think we'll have time for one or two more questions in this session. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you so much for your time and for such a lovely panel. My name is Jack Serif. I'm a 2L at Scalia Law School, and I'm also a Lebanese dual citizen. So as such, I'd like to ask a question about the future of Lebanon, which was mentioned briefly during the panel. So a couple interesting things that I think were mentioned that sparked my line of thought was, firstly, that Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. Not only are they a proxy of Iran, Hassan Nasrallah himself has said over the course of multiple decades that they directly answer to the IRGC, so they're essentially a marionette or puppet of Iranian colonization in the Levant. And now that they've been decapitated, obviously, as I think Mr. Ross mentioned, this presents an opportunity. Never let a good crisis go to waste, as they say. So what do you all think, sort of as an open matter, would be the alternative to a Hamas control of Lebanon, which can only occur because of them violating UN Security Council Resolution 1701 and maintaining a monopoly of violence over Lebanon? Just as a quick aside, I know that the heads of the Lebanese forces and Kataib parties last week met and discussed the future of Lebanon respective to the next president, a vacancy that's been ongoing for a couple of years. So considering that the Lebanese government hasn't picked up the trash in 30 years since the Civil War, and Lebanon obviously needs a steward, Iran or the Western powers, be it the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, what do you all see as the vision for state building in Lebanon, and to have that be aligned with Western security concerns and goals?
Thank you.
I'll start.
Take Lebanon.
Okay. Look, you made a point quite correctly that we've not had a president in Lebanon since Aoun left office on October 31, 2022, almost exactly 2 years ago. And that's because Nasrallah made sure that no one who wasn't acceptable to Hezbollah could become president. So the first step would seem to me, can we get Nami Berry to allow the parliament to convene and vote for a new president? I mean, can the U.S., French, and the Saudis Can they work together? Question earlier about coalitions. Can we create this kind of a coalition that can make a difference where a president is elected by the parliament who has the authority more than an acting prime minister, which Makati is, to be able to authorize the Lebanese army to not only to be out in force within Beirut, but deploy to the south as well. Now, can that be tied to, once you have the president, can we reach an agreement on what would be a ceasefire? Can we reach an agreement collectively on the idea of enforcing 1701? 1701 required Hezbollah not to be south of Litani. It required no rearming of Hezbollah. It was never observed. The UNIFIL, a so-called robust UNIFIL, was supposed to prevent Hezbollah from operating in the south. It was Hezbollah that prevented UNIFIL from operating in the south. We have the Prime Minister of Israel asking the Secretary General of the UN to move UNIFIL away from what are positions right next to these compounds that Hezbollah built. So the question becomes, it's hard, you're certainly not going to convince the Israelis that UNIFIL is going to act the way it never has. The question would be, will the Lebanese army be more prepared to act? And if not, what are the enforcement mechanisms we would be prepared to come up with? Because if there aren't enforcement mechanisms, you're just going to see everything replayed the way it was before, except for maybe you have a political set of leaders, and I say this with some trepidation because we've not exactly seen political leaders in Lebanon who seem prepared to assume more of a state responsibility, but can they be reinforced to the point where they would? So I don't have a magic solution here, but I think there's a sequence of steps that you would want to see.
Could I add one point? All those great ones, which is the economic factor. When I think of Lebanon, I think of it before the explosion and after in terms of economic impact. And to me, Lebanon was just starting to rebuild itself when this all happened. And as we talk about rebuilding, I think one thing I haven't heard is how you build Lebanon economically. There's no evidence that the Gulf states will invest in the way that they did after the Civil War to sort of build the downtown that we saw and have a real economic revitalization that I think is part of the diplomatic and governance part that you outlined so beautifully. And so I think as we think about Lebanon post-conflict, it's the complex governance, but also an equally complex economic situation.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to put a lot of pressure on you because we have time for one more question. So please finish us up.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Teresa. I'm a student volunteer, and I have a question from the YouTube. The apparent role, at least publicly, of USG in taking action against Hamas, particularly given numerous hostages, our USCIT, is troubling. Do you think the U.S. should have been involved publicly?
We don't know because it was a YouTube question, so we can't ask for clarification.
Not sure.
But take that where you want to in terms of where the U.S. policy stands now, not in terms of where it necessarily should be, but what are the primary variables in U.S. policy now?
As it relates to the hostages?
Yeah. I think primarily the hostages. That's my impression.
Well, all right, I'll start. Look, I think that because you had American hostages, the U.S. had a responsibility. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, I think you don't want to see hostages being taken, so we should have felt a need to get the hostages released unconditionally. That was obviously a desirable goal. You were not going to get Hamas to do that. But I think a lot of the focus needed to be on how we could build pressure on Hamas. I would say Israel didn't act in a way that made it easier to keep the pressure on Hamas. Israel's actions in a way, I wrote an article about this very early on. One of the mistakes the Israelis made from the beginning was not to be forthcoming on the issue of humanitarian assistance. From the very beginning, if Israel had been much more forthcoming on the issue of humanitarian assistance, as hard as that might have been politically within Israel, because the Israeli public felt, how should we do anything for Gazans when our hostages are being held, there's no access for the Red Cross and the like. But Israel needed time and space to be able to deal with what were their military objectives, and one way to produce time and space was to show this was about going after Hamas. It wasn't about going after the people of Gaza. And they didn't create that. Had they done that, it would have been easier to keep the frame on Hamas and their responsibility. And I want to answer, just comment briefly on the question that was raised, really the observation raised earlier, about the issue of radicalization as a result, that you were talking about as well, Mike, as a result of the way the war has been conducted. You know, this war for the Israelis created a really cruel dilemma. The cruel dilemma was, if you're dealing with Hamas that basically treats its whole public not as human shields, but actually as the public that is willing to be martyrs. The public was never asked whether they wanted to be martyrs. Israel had a choice. Either we go after Hamas, and unfortunately you're going to see a lot of Palestinians in Gaza get killed, or we don't go after Hamas, and Hamas wins that way. Israel answered that by saying, we're going after Hamas. They didn't do what I was suggesting, which is to show they did the maximum they could to relieve the humanitarian conditions and to try to minimize, to the extent that they could, the casualties. The consequence of that is it's going to be with us for some time to come, although probably less in Gaza than you might think. There's a recent poll that's out that shows 7% of the Gazans want Hamas to still control Gaza, 7%. There's a lot of anger at Israel, as you might imagine, but there also appears increasingly to be a lot of anger at Hamas, at least within Gaza. That may not be true internationally, because again, I don't think the issue was framed in a way that, you know, somehow kept the focus on Hamas the way it should have been. And the net effect is, and I've traveled quite a bit throughout the Middle East over the last year, and when you're watching any of the Arab satellite TV, you're seeing the death and destruction in Gaza, and how can you not be moved by that? You know, that's a reality. And part of what we need to be doing in terms of a policy, more generally, I think, is showing we're doing everything we can to try to change the reality in the aftermath of this war. It won't be easy, but as I was saying, there are some possibilities here. We also have to think about how we pursue those possibilities, but also how we frame what the objective in pursuing those possibilities is.
Please join me in thanking our guests.
So thanks to our panel for a very thoughtful discussion. Thank you to the audience for being a wonderful audience, both here in person and on YouTube. Thank you, Nancy, Dennis, Mark, and David for doing a wonderful moderating job. For those of you here in person, we got a great lineup of food and drinks across in the multipurpose room. Please join us there. Make your way out. Let our panel get there unmolested, and we'll see you shortly. Thank you.